There is a set of surnames that should not still exist. Not because they are rare in the way most old names are rare, fading slowly out of use over centuries. These names should not exist because the people who first carried them were, according to the traditional record, absorbed, converted, renamed, and folded so completely into the populations they settled among that their bloodlines were supposed to disappear entirely. And yet they didn't. A cluster of surnames, some Scandinavian in origin, some Anglo-Norse hybrids, some barely recognizable descendants of Old Norse patronymics, have survived in isolated pockets from the Scottish Isles to the Norman coastline to the fjords of western Norway. And when geneticists finally looked closely at the men carrying them, the DNA did not simply confirm a quiet Viking heritage. It suggested something stranger. A bloodline that moved further, mixed more, and lasted longer than the Viking Age itself was ever supposed to allow. For most of modern history, the story of Viking ancestry has felt almost comfortably settled. Historians and archaeologists built a fairly linear narrative. Norse seafarers from Scandinavia, driven by overpopulation, trade ambition, and political fragmentation, launched a series of raids and settlements beginning in the late 8th century. Over roughly 3 centuries, these expeditions raided, traded, settled, and occasionally conquered across Britain, Ireland, the North Atlantic islands, parts of France, and deep into Eastern Europe along the river systems toward the Black and Caspian Seas. Eventually, the story goes, these Norse settlers assimilated. They converted to Christianity, adopted local languages, intermarried, and within a handful of generations became indistinguishable from the populations around them. Norman French, Anglo-Saxon English, Gaelic Scots, Slavic Rus. The Viking Age ended. The narrative concludes, not with a battle, but with a quiet dissolving into the very cultures the Norse had once invaded. It is a tidy story. Explosive expansion, followed by graceful absorption. And for a long time, it seemed reasonable enough to leave unquestioned. That was the problem. Because linguists and genealogists working with surname records in isolated regions, the Northern Isles of Scotland, parts of Normandy, pockets of northwest England, remote valleys along the Norwegian coast, kept noticing something that didn't sit comfortably inside a story of total assimilation. Certain rare patronymic surnames, built from Old Norse personal names and suffix patterns, had not dissolved into the surrounding naming conventions the way the quiet absorption theory predicted. They had persisted, generation after generation, in tightly bounded communities, often tied to the same handful of villages or island parishes for the better part of 1,000 years. If the old story were fully accurate, total cultural absorption within a few generations, you would expect these distinctive names to blur, drift, and disappear far faster than they did. Something was off. The names were behaving less like fading echoes and more like anchors. Then genetics entered the investigation, and the tidy timeline of the Viking Age began to look considerably less tidy. Researchers working with population genetics in the North Atlantic and British Isles have relied on several overlapping tools to test the old assumptions. Y chromosome DNA, inherited almost unchanged from father to son across generations, is especially useful here because in patrilineal naming traditions, including most of the surname clusters at the center of this mystery, the Y chromosome and the family name tend to travel together down the same paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from mothers, offers a separate maternal record, one that reveals how women's ancestry moved differently than men's during the same period. And broader autosomal DNA, drawn from both parents and reshuffled every generation, allows researchers to estimate the overall proportion of Scandinavian ancestry present in modern populations, and to compare it against ancient Viking Age remains recovered from burial sites across Scandinavia and its former settlement zones. Researchers suggest that when these different genetic records are laid side by side, they do not simply reinforce a single clean migration story. They start to pull in different directions. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. In several isolated communities carrying these rare Norse-derived surnames, parts of Orkney and Shetland, certain Hebridean populations, and specific rural areas of Normandy, Y chromosome studies found a notably higher concentration of paternal lineages associated with Scandinavian source populations than the surrounding regional average. That part fit the expected story reasonably well. Strong male-line Norse ancestry surviving in the place's history says the Vikings settled most heavily. But the maternal picture, drawn from mitochondrial DNA, often told a more locally rooted story, with lineages tracing largely to pre-Viking indigenous populations of the British Isles or the Frankish mainland. The pattern researchers describe, a stronger Scandinavian signal on the paternal side than the maternal side, is consistent with a settlement process driven disproportionately by Norse men partnering with local women, generation after generation, rather than large-scale movement of entire family units from Scandinavia. That asymmetry alone might have been a satisfying enough answer. Except it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the first layer. Because when broader autosomal comparisons were run, measuring overall genome-wide ancestry rather than just the single paternal or maternal lines, a further complication emerged. In some of these surname-linked communities, the total proportion of detectable Scandinavian ancestry was significantly lower than the strength of the Y chromosome signal alone. Would suggest, while in others, the opposite was true, broader ancestry signals hinted at more sustained and repeated Scandinavian input than a single settlement wave could easily explain, suggesting contact and intermarriage continuing well beyond the traditionally accepted end of the Viking Age. What looked like a simple origin story, Norse raiders settle, assimilate, and fade into their host populations within a few generations, was beginning to look like a longer, messier, more layered history than the textbooks allowed. There are, broadly, 3 explanatory frameworks researchers have put forward to make sense of this pattern, and none of them alone fully accounts for everything the DNA shows. The first is what might be called extended contact rather than a single settlement wave, the idea that Norse-British, Norse-Gaelic, and Norse-Frankish interactions were not a one-time event confined neatly to the 8th through 11th centuries, but a much longer, intermittent relationship, with pulses of renewed Scandinavian contact through trade, later medieval seafaring, and localized resettlement continuing for generations after the official Viking Age was said to have ended. The second is a founder effect within already mixed communities, the possibility that a relatively small number of Norse-descended founding families, once established in isolated island or coastal locations, simply had high reproductive success and low outside contact for centuries afterward, meaning that even without ongoing Scandinavian immigration, their genetic and surname signature would remain unusually concentrated and visible today, out of proportion to how much broader mixing may have diluted it elsewhere. The third is subtler and more provocative, the possibility of an underlying ancestral layer connecting parts of coastal Atlantic Europe and Scandinavia that predates the Viking Age altogether, earlier prehistoric contact and shared ancestry along North Sea trade and migration routes, stretching back into the Bronze and Iron Ages, which may be partially responsible for some of the shared genetic signal researchers are detecting, independent of anything that happened after the year 793. Researchers remain cautious about weighting these explanations too heavily in either direction. The honest position, several genetic studies conclude, is that all 3 forces were likely operating simultaneously, layered on top of one another across more than a millennium. If this kind of layered detective work through DNA and deep history is the sort of thing you find genuinely fascinating, this is exactly the kind of channel worth sticking around for. The most significant advance in this picture came from large-scale ancient DNA studies that directly sequence remains from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and other settlement regions, then compared them systematically against both medieval and modern populations. Unlike earlier studies, which largely relied on modern DNA and worked backward through inference, ancient DNA offers something closer to a direct photograph of the population at the time. One widely discussed genome-wide study of Viking Age skeletal remains, published in the early 2020s, revealed a finding that surprised even researchers who expected diversity. Many individuals buried in identifiably Viking contexts, with Norse grave goods, Norse burial customs, Norse-style ships, did not carry predominantly Scandinavian ancestry at all. Some had genetic profiles closer to Sami, Baltic, Southern European, or even British populations, despite being buried as Norse warriors, traders, or settlers. That finding did not undermine the idea of Viking identity. It transformed it. It suggested that Viking, at least genetically, was never a single bloodline in the first place. It was closer to a cultural and economic identity that people of remarkably diverse ancestry could enter into, adopt, and be buried within. And that reframes the entire question of these 13, now 12, in this telling, surviving surnames. Because the twist is not simply that the modern carriers of these old Norse-derived names have some Scandinavian ancestry. Researchers already expected that. The twist is where else the genetic threads sometimes lead. In a handful of documented cases, men carrying rare, historically Norse-linked surnames in the Northern Isles and Northwest Highlands were found, through deep Y chromosome lineage testing, to belong not to the most common Scandinavian paternal lineages, but to rarer subbranches that also appear, in low frequencies, among populations far to the east. In parts of the Baltic and along old river trade routes into what is now Russia and Ukraine, the very corridors the Eastern Norse, the Rus, once traveled toward Byzantium. Not the group these families expected. Not even the region they expected. A surname assumed to mark a purely Western Viking heritage, tied to Scotland and Norway, instead carried a faint but detectable echo of the Eastern Norse world. The trading networks that connected Scandinavia not just to Britain and France, but all the way to Constantinople. The genome was not simply confirming a local, Western story of Viking settlement. It was quietly preserving evidence of a genuinely global network, one where a family in a remote Scottish parish might carry a paternal thread connecting them, faintly but measurably, to trade routes that once reached the walls of the Byzantine Empire. What this reveals extends far beyond 12 surnames or one seafaring culture. It means the human past rarely moves in the single, straight lines our textbooks prefer. The Viking Age was not one migration. It was many overlapping ones, raiding, trading, settling, intermarrying, converting, and occasionally reversing course, over more than 3 centuries and across a geographic span from Newfoundland to Baghdad. Populations are not pure streams that begin at one source and flow untouched to the present. They are deltas, braided, merging, splitting, sometimes disappearing underground for generations before resurfacing in an unexpected place, like a surname in a windswept Scottish parish carrying a faint genetic signature from the Volga trade routes. Old maps were too simple, not because the people who made them were careless, but because a map drawn from written records alone can only show what was written down, and so much of what actually happened between people was never written down at all. It was only ever carried forward in blood and in names. Picture, for a moment, the landscape where so many of these names still cling on. The cliffs of Orkney, wind-scoured and treeless, where the North Atlantic meets gray basalt in a line that has not meaningfully changed since longships first beached on these shores. Turf-roofed farmsteads that have stood, rebuilt but essentially unmoved, on the same low rises for 1,000 years. Below, in the sheltered Vosges, the water holds the kind of stillness that only comes after violence has long since passed. The raiding decades ago, the sagas older still, the graves under the machair grass holding bones that, centuries later, would end up compared letter by letter against a database on the other side of the world. In these places, the wind carries salt and peat smoke, and the Old Norse names are still spoken at kitchen tables, unremarkably, the way any family name is spoken, with no one at the table aware of quite how far the threads inside them actually reach. That is the quiet power of this kind of evidence. It asks for no drama to be profound. So the story of these 12 rare Viking surnames is not really a closed chapter about raiders who came, conquered, and eventually disappeared into the populations around them. It is a story about how much of that disappearance was only ever apparent. A surface smoothing over a much more intricate structure underneath, one built from centuries of contact, intermarriage, migration, and quiet endurance. The old narrative of a defined Viking age with a clear beginning, a clear ending, and a clean absorption into modern nations was not wrong so much as it was too small for what actually happened. The real picture is larger and stranger, a network stretching from the fjords of Norway to the steppes near the Caspian Sea, a genetic and cultural identity that welcomed people of remarkably different origins, and family names that, against every expectation of dissolution, kept the thread visible for 1,000 years. The mystery is not resolved. It has only widened. Because if 12 surnames in a handful of windswept parishes can carry echoes of trade routes stretching to Byzantium, then somewhere inside almost every old family name still spoken today, there is very likely a similar thread waiting, a forgotten meeting between peoples, preserved not in any book, but in the quiet, patient archive of the genome itself. If stories like this are the kind of hidden history you want more of, subscribe, because the truth about where we come from is almost always larger than the story we were first told.